And thank you so much for being with us this evening.
But again, I had 10 minutes, so I figured the best place to start is probably 1917, and let's kind of do a long kind of 100-year span through kind of Ukraine-Russian history, focusing really on 1917, 1918, and then how things evolved really during the Soviet period. So we'll start with, where green line is Ukraine today. We'll see how it evolves through time, coming out of the end of the Russian Empire with the Tsar in 1917, and how it evolves into the Soviet Union and then back into its own unique state as an independent nation here, as you see it on the map. So in 1917, as you may well know, with the Soviets and the Bolsheviks putting significant pressure on the provisional government, is the first instance where Ukraine is going to declare itself an independent republic. So as a provisional government, if Kerensky falls, the Bolsheviks start a new revolution. The Ukrainians who have been under the Russian kind of yoke now see an opportunity to declare a People's Republic of Ukraine, which is the first instance of independence in quite some time. Along and people doing great things. That won't last very long though, as we'll see here in a few minutes, because 1917, the end of the year, was pretty good for Ukraine. Becomes this new independent republic, but the reality is 1918 is going to be a really bad year for Ukraine. And Russian relations, by the way. And I think this is kind of where we see some of the tensions in the East and the West, so this is why I decided to kind of focus on this era. In 1918, the Red Army was quickly going to overthrow the Rada, or the Central Council, in Ukraine. This is the beginning of the Russian Civil War. Ukraine is going to be a hotbed of Russian Civil War activity between whites who support the Tsar, reds who support the Bolsheviks, greens who are kind of Cossack but also kind of doing their own thing and want kind of independent Ukraine, and then also blacks, which are anarchists, by the way. So Ukraine is this hot spot of really radical kind of political tension to see who's going to control this significant territory, which is really the breadbasket of Europe. So in 1918, the Red Army is going to offer this first iteration of overthrows. They're going to overthrow that Central Council, the Rada, and they're going to establish a Soviet system in spring of 1918. But remember, the war's going on still, right? So the World War I is still kind of happening. We haven't had Brest-Litovsk yet, so this is kind of in, let's say, early February to mid-February. Germany is going to launch a counter coup against the Soviets, and they're going to install a right-wing government under Paul Skorpolsky, which is significant. And right-wing meaning kind of supporting, more of the monarchists. In the span of about 3 months, they've had 4 different governments already, right? From October through kind of March of 17 to 18, which is pretty significant, right? Talk about political turbulence. This is the very definition of political turbulence, all right? So that Ukrainian national element, the Rada, is going to overthrow Skorpinski, and then in that brief period of time, for about 2.5, 3 weeks, they're going to be in power, and then Anton Denikin, the white supporters, right, who supports the Tsar, is going to come in and overthrow the Rada again. So this is their 5th government now in the span of 5 months, if you're keeping track at home, right? And then by 1919, the Soviets and the Red Army are going to restore order over Ukraine and start to bring it into the fold of kind of what becomes the Soviet Union. Ukraine is going to go through a famine in the same period, 1920 to 1923, simply because years of drought are going to have a significant impact on wheat and a whole bunch of other crops. And the Red Army is going to try to distribute what they can throughout what becomes the Soviet Union as they're fighting and trying to solidify what becomes the Soviet Union, what we know as the Russian Civil War. The reality, and how I think the best to characterize the situation, is that Ukraine is in political chaos. Depends on whoever kind of want to do their things and really formulate more political entities down in the Donbass region, and then you have the anarchists who are still there as well. So you still have those 5 elements that you see at the beginning, and in many ways, you'll see Ukraine, which you can compare to today, is the Western elements of Ukraine seem to be more independent, fiercely independent, more allied with kind of the West. Eastern elements more allied with what becomes Russia or the Soviet Union, which that division you still see significantly today as a fighting around Kharkov in that Donbass region. Okay, so parallels to today are rampant throughout. December 1922, the Soviet Union is officially declared, so the Bolsheviks have finally solidified power. And Ukraine is part of this original Soviet Union. They're one of the entities that forms what becomes the Soviet Union, which is significant. But the problem that Lenin has, and then Stalin's going to have significantly, is the question of Ukrainian commitment to the cause. Are they truly loyal to the Soviet system? Because you have those elements of Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian language and Ukrainian traditions, which have been around for centuries. And that's going to create some issues in Stalin's eyes, which we'll see here in a few minutes. So they're into the system, they're firmly under control. Those elements of Ukrainian nationalism are suppressed by first Lenin forces and then Stalinist forces to ensure that they are brought into the fold of the Soviet Union. So you can't speak the Ukrainian language, the language becomes Russian, and traditions and entities of Ukraine become suppressed within the context of one Soviet system for all. But at the same time, systematic famine being caused. Because what you'll do is you'll take foodstuffs, livestock from farms that have it, and distribute it throughout the countryside. But it's an attempt, a systematic attempt from the Soviet system to ensure that Ukrainians are recognized. This period, 3.9 million are Ukrainian. So it's pretty significant, the fact that Stalin really wants to demonstrate that the way we keep you in check is cold hard power, and if we have to starve you to death, we will do that. So you start to see the beginnings of the tension that you see between Ukrainians and Soviets or Russians, at least in the last 100 years, necessarily don't go away. World War II, so I'm moving quickly because we have a little time, right? So once the interwar period happens and the starvation happens, and it's going to be over by 33, 34, the Ukrainians are kind of kept in check by the Soviet system. World War II is going to produce the next opportunity through which you're going to see more of that tension rise up, because as German forces move through Poland and into what becomes Ukrainian positions, there are strong elements in the West that will fight with the Germans, because I'm not a big fan of Stalin, right? Because Stalin just did that horrible famine to you. So now you fight with the Germans, which creates another position that Stalin doesn't like you anymore out. So again, forces in the East tend to be much more affiliated with Russia, as you still see today. Forces in the West tend to be whoever's going to help them throw off the yoke of Stalin, and the Soviets are the work for them, which is significant. You end up in a farm with no equipment and nothing to kind of prosper and grow. So again, Ukraine is always being held in check, at least in this kind of early modern era, or contemporary era, by cold hard power, in one way or another, by the Soviet state. There are moments of hope, though, if we want to call it from the Soviet side, right? In March 5th, 1953, Stalin's going to die, right? Which is a good thing for the Ukrainians, right? He's the guy who's kind of held them in check. And Nikita Khrushchev is going to be one of the elements who's going to be vying for power in the Soviet state, and he comes from the Donbass region. So to see him as kind of one of their own who may have, the ability to bring Ukraine back to at least an equal footing, which they thought they were coming into in 1918, 1919, 1920, which they weren't. They were always in a supportive position. Khrushchev, former head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, and in September of '53, he's going to, as a peace offering to the people of Ukraine, he's going to cede Crimea to the good people of Ukraine. He's going to move forward in time. And he sees this as a significant gesture, right? And the fact that they've been through so much since 1918, 1917, that if you give Crimea to Ukraine, you demonstrate that, okay, we're giving you back this valuable piece of land, which has significant naval base to Sevastopol. It's a way to kind of calm everybody down and demonstrate that we respect you and that you're willing to work with us and we want to work with you. And it's kind of an attempt to kind of offer a sign of peace and reconciliation. And I would argue that it seems to work, at least for those elements that kind of want to go along to get along. You've been through so much from 1917 that, okay, it looks like it's okay. Khrushchev is not quite as heinous as Stalin, but is one of our own, so maybe we would trust him. So I would argue that for the duration of the Cold War, really 54 till kind of the end of the Cold War, there are moments where Ukraine will get a little insecure about its position and want a little more recognition of parity with Russia, but the reality is they recognize a comfortable position after 54 as a comfortable kind of chunk in the Soviet Union. independence with the Baltic states as well. So you're gonna have, in the span of, 60, 70 years, you have this, part of the Russian Empire, independent, then a whole series of governments back and forth, firm position within the Soviet Union, and now at the end of the Soviet Union, quickly declare independence again. And on a reverse kind of moment to Khrushchev's point, Crimea carry the hatchet once again and demonstrate that Ukraine and Russia need to kind of work together as powers in what will become kind of the new world order. Right? So that's kind of a fast, quick idea of tension. I'll make the argument that the political turmoil you see in Ukraine during this period, really, I would argue the first part of the 20th century, is some of the same kind of tension you see today with different actors. The Russian position and Putin's position of seeing Ukraine as wholly Russian is not just Tsarist in outlook, but also Soviet in outlook as well. On that note, I'll let Merrill talk about his unique experiences.
And seeking some type of European integration. And on the other hand, you have the Russian population that really want to keep Ukraine as part of Russia. And the way I've heard it explained is there are three important cities to the Russians. There's St. Petersburg, there's Moscow, and there's Kyiv. St. Petersburg is the heart of Russia, Moscow is the brain, and Kyiv is the womb in which birthed the Russian people. And so keeping that in mind as to why Russia looks at Ukraine, and particularly Kyiv, as something that's integral. It's part of their body. They don't even fathom life without it. So to start kind of my journey off, as a foreign area officer, part of our training to become certified as an Army FAO, as we call ourselves, is to spend a year of cultural immersion. So I spent a year traveling the former Soviet republics. Had the opportunity to take my family with me as we traveled to exotic places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, through the Caucasus, and into the Baltics. Well, part of my journey was to spend 3 months as an intern at the embassy in Kyiv. I arrived in early October. Pretty non-revolution started. As things started to get really, really violent, and then my time ended and I went home, and like everyone else, I watched it play out on TV. I think this discussion that we're having is very timely. If you look at it, tomorrow marks the 8th anniversary at the end of the Maidan Revolution, in which the Ukrainian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, signed an agreement to give up power to an interim government. Today could arguably be the 7th anniversary of when little green men popped up in Crimea. And of course, in 2 days, we're going to see the 1-year anniversary of open hostilities between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So as we come back, I brought this slide up mainly to kind of focus on what is happening prior to the start of the revolution. We find ourselves in 2014, the European Union and Ukraine have come together and have initialed, not signed, an accessions agreement for Ukraine to start moving towards EU membership. As we crept towards November and the date in which the Ukrainian government was supposed to sign that accessions agreement, we start to see doubts coming out of the Yanukovych government. They start publicizing this, move to the EU is going to hurt our economy. The EU is going to need to compensate us significantly in the tunes of upwards of anywhere $50 billion at one time, they were saying. The EU countered and said, we'll give you 600 million, which didn't satisfy. There were additional complications in that the former prime minister was under arrest, in which allies of hers saw this as a political move by Russian, pro-Russian elements to suppress Ukrainian voices, and the EU wanted to see her released mainly because her health was deteriorating. As the summit approached on the 28th, 29th of November, 2 days prior, a Ukrainian official came out and said, hey, Russia's really asked us not to sign this agreement, so we're probably not going to sign it. In which the Russian spokesman quickly comes out and says, well, we don't interfere with Ukrainian internal politics. Fast forward 8 years later, and it doesn't seem so. The next series of events, starting on about the 17th of November, like I said, I'm an intern, just kind of bebopping around the city, not much going on. I started to notice flyers were being handed out. As you came through the metro, someone was handing you a piece of paper. So what it was saying was, come down to the Maidan on the 24th and let the government know that you want them to sign the accessions agreement. This to the ambassador. And the ambassador said, nothing's going to come of it. Unless they get 1 million people on that square, nothing is going to happen with this rally. Ukraine is firmly in the Russian camp. So as I'm sitting there as a young major listening to our senior U.S. official and the 2 top military officials in the country say that the Maidan Revolution was dead upon arrival, was never going to happen. And I bring this up because as we go through, and if you look back at the headlines, and especially headlines that came out of Russia, everything stated that the whole Maidan was influenced and driven by outside actors. It couldn't possibly be the Ukrainians themselves, because the Ukrainians love Russia, is what Russia's point. So just understanding that, at least from the US point of view and the government's point of view, nothing was going to happen with this November 24th rally. So people are going to show up, they're going to have slogans, they're going to carry signs, and then it'll be dead. So it's shrinking. That initial night, as I heard from my apartment, there were probably about 250,000 people on the square. I went out and kind of mingled in it, saw what was going on, thought to myself, this is a really neat experience. I'm going to be able to talk about the rest of my life. But the head people at the embassy said this doesn't mean anything. Well, the night of the 30th, if you can see in the picture on the lower left, this little structure that has all the signs on it, that's actually the Ukrainians' Christmas tree. It's a metal structure that they put up in the square. Well, Yanukovych really wanted it erected by the 1st of December. So he ordered on the night of the 30th for the Berkut, for their riot police to come in and wipe everybody off, push them out, so they could erect their Christmas tree to kick off the Christmas season. That galvanized the people. To see people, the riot police come out and beat people, caused more people to come out on the square and start pushing back. So we have an increase in people, and you start to see the camps show up around the Maidan. At this time, the Ukrainian political parties, everybody's kind of rushing to the scene to try and get ownership of this movement. And the people, in my opinion, is the first time I've ever seen a truly grassroots maneuver. They rejected the politicians, wanted nothing to do with them. Because for them, this was their dignity, their opportunity to tell the politicians what they wanted. So as we come up on the 9th of November, they pulled down the Lenin statue, which was on the opposite side of Krashatik, the big boulevard where they host their Victory Day parades every year. I'm actually in this series of pictures on the side with the photographer. I got a call from my friend who was in Georgia, the country, not the state, whose girlfriend was in Ukraine to tell me that they were pulling the statue down. So I was actually in the shower, jumped out of the shower, threw my clothes on, and ran down to the scene just in time to see him pull down the statue. As the man is, he was soon replaced with the little man with the chisel. And I saw a little chunk fall off and nobody grabbed it. So I kind of maneuvered myself over and picked it up, and I have it at home. This was the start of the Ukrainians really saying, Russia, you've betrayed us. You've ruined our opportunity to improve ourselves and to gain more of a European identity. Where the cameraman is in this picture is up on a hill, and just beyond that is the presidential palace. He organized the Barracuda at the palace, and he flowed them down the hill to where you see them in the line. And they started to attack the protesters. The next day, on the 12th of December, there were 1 million people on the square. And from that point on, there was no stopping the Maidan Revolution. It continues on into November, or into February. And really the main action on the 18th to the 18th to the 22nd, over 100 people are killed. Many of them by snipers on rooftops, on the order of the government. I've heard this described as prior to this action, Ukrainians always saw Russians as their brothers. Shared language, shared religion, shared history. This started to change everything. And then as we move on to Crimea and the Little Green Men and then the Donbass, has really changed that, in which these grievances of the past that Sean talked about really have come to the surface for the Ukrainians, where they're saying, we are Europeans, we are Ukrainians, we are not Russians. We decide our future.
So I'll do it briefly because I know we want to get to questions. Well, I was once told, when someone like a diplomat says, "I will be brief," sit back, get comfortable. This is going to be a long presentation. But years into a simmering conflict, and about a year into a very, very hot war in Ukraine. And how do we get here? One school of thought, primarily coming from the Russians, is, well, it's NATO's fault. This is all about NATO. NATO enlargement, NATO control over Ukraine, and oh, by the way, with the United States controlling NATO as well, kind of pulling the puppet strings as well. And it's a convenient narrative for the Russians, and it helps them justify and explain a lot of what they're doing. But it's also, there's a theoretical argument behind it too. And I was, before we came in, one of you were talking about a fellow by the name of John Mersheimer, who's a US political scientist. He's a realist. And the realist point of view is, well, it's the West's fault that's what is happening in Ukraine. Because you're impinging on Russia's sphere of influence, therefore Russia's going to react, they're going to push back, and it's going to be violent. It's interesting. I don't buy it completely. I don't buy it much at all, as a matter of fact, as well. And as I'll show in my next slide, which I'll get to soon, remember I said I'd be brief, there's a one person involved who made decisions here as well. And what I've picked out here is, first of all, there's a map of NATO enlargement. By the way, NATO enlarges, does not expand. We don't use the expand word when we talk about NATO, even though in Russian the word is the same for both, which makes things more confusing. But if you look at quotes here, and these are basically attributed to Vladimir Putin. 2004, what happened in 2004? The Baltic states joined NATO. Significant emotional event for Putin and the Russians, but not that wound up about it, if we look at the quote there. Okay, yeah, it wasn't a good thing, but okay, we're going to get by it. His tune had changed a little bit by 2007 when he made a somewhat infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference. By the way, this year's just concluded in Munich over the weekend. He made a speech at the Munich Security Conference where he basically blasted the United States, NATO, the West in general. And he raised the question that the Russians keep bringing up, saying, hey, look, when the Cold War ended, the Warsaw Pact went away, why is NATO still there? What is NATO there to defend against? Well, for those countries that chose to join NATO, starting with Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, it was very clear what NATO was there to protect them from. That was the Russian Federation. Which is, Russia's kind of self-destructive when it comes to NATO, but I'll get to that in just a sec. If we look at what happened in 2008, a more significant emotional event for the Russians, which is when NATO decided Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, parentheses, at a date and time yet to be determined. But again, the Russians, and Putin was actually there at the NATO summit when this took place, and he said, yeah, okay, you're okay, but notice the quote, Ukraine is a complicated state formation. This is where you actually see Putin overtly saying, and he said it to President Bush on the sidelines too, and Ukraine really isn't a state. It isn't really a state. Come on, get past that. So there's a bit more writing on the wall there. And then we see, attributed to Putin again just this last year, when Sweden and Finland moved away from Greenland, Crimea, all that good stuff. It's now placed in the Ukrainian constitution. They're striving to join NATO and the European Union. Significant change. Thank you, Russia. Same thing with Sweden and Finland. Would Sweden and Finland have thought about joining NATO without Russia's invasion of Ukraine? No, not at this time. Certainly not. Well, if it's not NATO, then what's going on here? I suggest, and I think I'm not the only one, this is all about Vladimir Putin and where he is at this point in his life and in his career in charge of the Russian Federation. And in fact, if you go back to when he became the leader of the Russian Federation in 1999-2000, when he assumed the presidency from Boris Yeltsin, one of his first acts was to crush the Second Chechen Rebellion. And he staked a lot of his political career on his success in crushing that rebellion and in exceptionalism there. And I think where things really change for Putin, when okay Putin becomes really evil Putin, bad Putin, is the picture that's down there at the bottom of all those people protesting. What are they? It was a bit of a wake-up call for Putin. Probably as emotional experience for him as back in the days when he was in Dresden with the KGB and all these crazy East Germans were deciding they wanted to throw off the communist yoke. And he saw that. And from there on, what you see is a change, a more rapid change within Russia. More crackdown on civil society. Restrictions placed on non-government controlled press. Laws passed designating any organization that receives any funding or has connections with anyone abroad as foreign agents. And again, all this is happening because I think Putin is beginning to feel the heat. He does not feel that he has the control that he wants. And sort of the culmination of all this comes, oh, you think, right, 2014, right? No, not 2014, 2020. What happens in 2020? Well, there, I've got picture the thing with the funny writing at the lower left-hand corner. That's the Constitution of the Russian Federation, Конституция Российской Федерации. So when Putin's starting to come up with he's got a problem. The Russian Constitution says you can only serve 2 terms as president. Not 2 consecutive, it just says 2 terms as president. Oh my gosh, can't do that. He's running out of terms as president. What is he going to do? So they start talking about changes to the Constitution. That one, they've already lengthened the term of office to 6 years. That happened while Putin was prime minister. So when he came back to be president the second time, oh wow, I got 6 years instead of 4. What in Parliament? Her name is Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. She proposed, I have a proposal. We'll change the Constitution, but Putin's terms as president already don't count. We'll start the clock again. Which means he gets 12 more years, 12 more years. He's going to get 12 more years as president. And the Duma, the legislature, dutifully passes it, refer back to not conducted in accordance with international standards. And then the people vote in a referendum, not conducted in accordance with international standards. And it passes, so now Putin has got himself secured. He has secured his legacy. He can avoid the succession issue. Look in Russia, there is no successor. It's like, who's the vice president? No, there's not a vice president. There's nobody going to step in. So Putin has now secured his position, now he's got to secure his legacy. His legacy is to restore Russia's greatness and to begin gathering the Russian lands in back again. Thus the picture of the lovely lady over on the right, Catherine the Great, part of the lands that she gathered into the Russian Empire are what Putin and the Russians call Novorossiya. It's what the Ukrainians call a part of Ukraine, along the Black Sea there. And he's also channeling Peter the Great, the gentleman with the mustache there. And why Peter the Great? Again, Peter the Great built empire, gathered in the lands. In fact, recently in December of last year, June of last year, Putin was at a exhibition of 350th anniversary of Peter the Great's birth in St. Petersburg. He had a little chat with some entrepreneurs afterwards, and we made lots of little asides about, oh yes, basically he's doing the same thing as Peter the Great. So he views himself in that light. He views himself, Dr. Caleb made a point, well, what's going on? It's the same thing that happened with Tsars and with the Soviets and Putin. Putin doesn't reach back to the Soviets for his influence. He goes all the way back to the Tsars. I think he truly views himself as a Tsar. The first one up on the left, that's how he meets with his government. He started with COVID. He was obviously terrified of getting COVID. He started with COVID, but that's how he meets with them. So when you talk about making decisions about things like going to war, there may have been some flaws in the decision-making process, and this might be part of it because he doesn't meet with a lot of people. It's a very small group of advisors that talk to him. The other photo, and I'll close with this, is the one on the right, was a truly bizarre occasion. This is when Putin met with his National Security Council. Yeah, all right, they were far away, okay? And the reason for the meeting, this is before the war in Ukraine started, was to get them to endorse the autonomy of the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions of Ukraine. And he had this bizarre meeting. He sits completely across the room from a bunch of the ministers look like a bunch of school children being chided. It's great, they have no tables, so it's really uncomfortable. And by the way, this thing was all taped, edited, and posted on the website of the Russian president so everybody can see it. And he makes them all basically say, I agree. It was a really great moment that reminded me of Russian language school, where this war has been good for him. You're thinking, whoa, what's he talking about? They're getting their clocks clean, this isn't good. Domestically, this war is good for Putin. And the longer it goes on, the better it is for him. Because he can mobilize the country against a Western threat. And as one of the more right-wing people in Russia has said, liberalism is being eliminated and a longer war is better. And with that, I will close my comments. Thank you very much, folks. This is the classified information. I don't even try to get access. No, I have no idea who did. I think to determine that, you'd have to look at who has an interest in that pipeline being disrupted. So I have no idea. I have no clue. As for a possible Israeli deal, the Israelis certainly put themselves forward as mediators, but I'm not aware of any concrete deal that was offered to either side. Israel finds themselves in kind of a tough position. One, they have a significant interest in maintaining good relations with the Russian Federation for a variety of reasons. But they also have a significant interest in maintaining good relations with Ukraine and with the United States. So they're in a bit of a sticky situation. So, sorry.